is Jane Low on site at the SANS ICS APAC Summit and Training 2022. And I'm very pleased and very privileged that Tim Conway, who is a SANS instructor and also the technical director of the ICS and SCADA program at SANS, right?
Well.
Yes,
Correct.
Joining us today. So thank you, Tim, for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, Tim, you have very extensive experience, right, from the US with Indiana State, one of the largest, if I understand right, electric and gas company, and you were a computer engineer looking after control systems and also the supporting networks infrastructure. So a ton of experience, and so very grateful for your time to share your insights and experience with us today. So if I could just start with a question, if I look at your profile as a SANS instructor, you focus on ICS, and
True.
Of course the summit here is about ICS as well. So I thought that we could start with talking about what we mean by ICS, because I think it stands for Industrial Control Systems, and for many of us, we immediately think that it's anything to do with industrial processes. So chemical plants, electric plants, utilities, power plants. Mm-hmm. But some may think, okay, what about those SCADA systems that are not quite industrial in nature?
Correct. Telecoms,
right?
Yes.
Transport. Mm-hmm. And then you throw in the terms such as, operational technology and critical infrastructure, and then we all have different ideas of what ICS means.
Yes.
So tell us, what is ICS?
That's our goal. We're trying to confuse everybody. They don't know what we're defending.
You're doing it very well. You're doing it very well.
They don't know what to attack. So there's it's one of the things we talk about in class quite a bit, and we often start with a very common catch-all term that is called cyber to physical. So really moving away from information technology, where you're looking at data in rest or data in use or data in motion. A normal information technology class would focus on securing data on a server, securing data on a network, securing data on an endpoint. We're talking about data that does something and data that means something. So it has a kinetic component, it has a physics component, and it could be at a large scale like SCADA covering multiple states, or it could be at a plant floor distributed control system, could be an individual PLC, and you could even start to blend into the operational technology and the Internet of Things, where people are adding kind of the I at the front, the industrial Internet of Things, where they're using small edge devices to control certain parts of buildings and smart cities or transportation. Cyber to physical is probably the one term that catches everything across all the different domains of building automation, healthcare, patient care systems,
medical devices,
large-scale critical infrastructure. Really getting into just that basic understanding. We're talking about something that has a cyber physical component, a kinetic and physics element, not just data.
Right. So going forward, you would change the term from ICS to cyber
physical is what you would find in any conversation, so everybody knows what you're talking about. That if you're talking to a very large company like a Southern company or a Duke, they understand they have IT systems, that is how they manage their business, and they have industrial control systems and OT, that is why they're a business.
Right.
So two different sides of the organizations.
Right, okay. So I guess regardless of the terms we use, whether it's operational technology, OT, or ICS, or cyber physical systems, there's some common principles when it comes to cyber protection and cyber defense, I guess, right?
Yes, true.
So which we will get into in the later part of the conversation. So coming back to the term ICS and cyber physical systems, I think the other common question that many people would ask is, what is the threat landscape looking like, right, when it comes to cyber physical systems? And then many of us talk about StuxNet, 2010, and Ukraine, blackouts. And so tell us about the current threat landscape. And because I'm just thinking, right, the research reports that I read for this year, so they talk about, for example, pipe dream, right? But it was sort of caught in some sense before
in development.
Yeah, right. So it seems like even though the threat actors are getting more sophisticated, our cyber defenses are getting a lot more sophisticated as well. Of course. Yep. So your thoughts?
Yes, it's not all bad news. There's the bad news component is we're starting to see movement from untargeted malware that just made its way into critical infrastructure because of poor segmentation many, many years ago. We've now kind of improved that capability with additional segmentation and perimeter defense and detection. Then you've started to see adversaries with a defined interest in industrial control systems. So that could have been many years ago from a data collection so that they could go build similar plants without the necessary research and investment, just kind of intellectual property theft. And then it has started to move into process manipulation. So the obtaining of data, you'd referenced Stuxnet, and looking towards some of the Ukraine 2015 attacks and the Havex Dragonfly campaigns, information collection so targeted attacks could come back. The three that have moved into a misuse world where we look to Ukraine 2016, and we see the intentional disruption of the protection system so they could cause equipment failure on the circuit breakers and the substation gear. Then in the Trisis attacks going after safety instrumented systems, which that would only be for the purpose of causing human loss of life or equipment damage. And now with Pipe Dream, again, moving into this modular malware framework where it's a force multiplier for an adversary group. Everybody doesn't need to know the environment. They can kind of piece together different modules to achieve a goal. Right. So you saw...
It's like Lego, building a Lego.
Yes, correct.
Right.
So some of the different modules that they allow for initial access with Dust Tunnel, that module, that really helps them with a command control channel, similar to Ukraine 2015 with Black Energy 3. And then as you move into, once in that environment and they want to pivot into the next level, looking towards Mousehole as the ability to move through a data historian, and then the ability to load whatever content they need with lazy cargo so they can load unsigned drivers, and then it allows them to attack multiple different types of control system platforms running Omron or Schneider with two different modules, Evil Scholar and Bad Omen. So if you look at that whole set, that can be used in multiple sectors where those devices are found, or some of those modules can be used based on what the adversary is trying to achieve. That same capability set, if that was available to the adversary during Colonial Pipeline, for example, that would have allowed for easy movement between the different levels and direct manipulation. So as we kind of look backwards on a number of attacks that happened that were declared as criminal or ransomware, using modular malware like this, it could have easily moved into more misuse of systems or damage.
Right, yeah, I was going to ask you about ransomware and wiperware because I think the incidents that we've heard so far really kind of stop before it go into the other operational technology engineering environment, right?
Yes, and I think that's very important now. So some of the attacks that have happened around the world, not just in U.S., but in U.S., if you look at the JBS attacks against kind of food and agriculture production, you look towards Colonial Pipeline, and we were okay then declaring them as criminal ransomware types of attacks, looking for other nations to have policies and methods to go prevent them. Now, post-February 23rd, post the Ukraine war, I think even those same types of attacks now would get a different level of response or a different level of care if the same exact attack occurred now, because of fog of war and kind of which countries sponsored the attackers, whether they were nation state or just the fact that they allowed it to occur from within their country outward.
So are you saying that our cyber defenses or mitigation measures will, to a huge extent, depends on our attribution to which,
attribution is very difficult, country to country and throughout history. You know, kind of after 9/11 attacks, we declared war on terrorism, which isn't necessarily against any particular country, or it's a way of thinking. In a similar way, when you look towards these ransomware attacks and trying to find out where the adversary was coming from, and if they are hopping through multiple countries that don't work well together and won't share data and won't share logs, it becomes a very difficult thing to do with complete accuracy.
Right, okay. And of course, it becomes difficult to deploy the law enforcement capabilities as well across jurisdictions.
And from an asset owner operator, most of that stuff isn't what you spend your day worrying about. The who and the why. You spend your day worrying about what did they achieve and how do you continue to ensure safe, reliable operations. There's different parts of this where intelligence and governments, and they're focused on the who's and the whys. The asset owners and operators are focusing on how do we continue to operate through an attack. Yeah,
so talking about how do we continue to protect our assets, right? And of course, you're a SANS instructor. You do teach a lot of different, I guess, different focuses within this so-called ICS or cyber-physical environment. So tell us how the threat environment over the last, I don't know, decade since Stuxnet shaped the way that you think about the syllabus and, you know, the program that you are looking after.
Yeah, we're just like any university where you would have a college of business, college of law, college of engineering, where there's different areas of focus. Within SANS Institute, there's We have cyber defense, we have penetration testing and offensive operations, we have forensics. I specifically have the view from an industrial control system perspective in that curriculum. So we focus more on how to design, how to engineer, how to operate, ensure safety, ensure reliability. There's other parts of our curriculum that look at threat intelligence and look at forensics and kind of attribution and working cases from different angles. For us, we are looking to how do we detect, how do we defend, how do we continue to ensure operations while an attack is occurring?
Yeah.
And even to the level of how do we use the cyber digital assets and engineer them differently so certain misuse cases can be eliminated.
Right, okay. So yeah, it's not only just for from the threat perspective that you are shaping your syllabus, it's also from, I guess, the extent to which we are digitalizing or transforming, right?
Absolutely.
In the ICS sector. So how does that affect or rather impact,
of course,
the kind of courses
so
that you teach?
We absolutely meet students kind of where they are when they come in. We're not a university model where you have to have certain prerequisites in our public runs. We have students that come in at the course that they want to take. So they're from different sectors, different spaces and places. Some of them are still using electromechanical controls and have low digitalization, kind of low digital cyber assets. Others are fully adopted, fully automated, top to bottom.
Right.
So we're covering kind of existing environments, legacy environments, and how you would build new. And now in the kind of moving forward, how
cloud
you integrate
migration environment.
Yes, industrial cloud operations and how you integrate and run. And depending on asset type, there's some conversations that may make sense. Offshore wind farms, and where there's not people.
Okay.
So integrating more with cloud or remote operation or remote control compared to a chemical factory in the middle of a town, trying to run that and operate through the cloud has very different concerns.
Right, okay. So talking about like coming from different regions or different industry sectors, what about, say, for example, we take the example of, say, from an Asia Pacific point of view, say, for example, Singapore, right?
Sure.
And take your experience of being a computer engineer in the electric sector, right? So looking at the Singapore's electric grid, I'm just a superficial sort of observer. I understand that the distribution, the generation, the transmission infrastructure is probably not as sophisticated and as complex as, say, in Indiana State or in the U.S. So how do you tailor, what you?
I think a lot of the variances would be on the different types of fuel. So just you look at the geography here, you don't have a lot of kind of elevation where hydro facilities would make sense, and you don't have a tremendous amount of coal that you would source, you have to import. So a lot of coal-based power generation, you're not going to have as many generation assets. You might rely more on liquid natural gas or natural gas fuel that liquid natural gas imports, and then natural gas fuel that you might use. Solar takes a lot of land, a lot of physical space. So does wind. You don't have a lot of land and physical space available, as I've looked around the country. So there's certain types of generation that you have to move towards. And based on that, you have to determine sort of total capacity that you can import, capacity that you could sell and export out. And then looking at all of your other interdependent critical infrastructure, how much do they lean on each other? So how much does the generation lean on the natural gas? How much does the natural gas infrastructure lean back on transmission and distribution to power its pumps and compressor stations? There's kind of a critical infrastructure domino effect that happens where the different things are leaning on each other, and when there's a failure of one, it can cause a failure of others. Okay,
so from a protection of a critical infrastructure point of view, how would Singapore's perspective be different from, say, from someone who is in? I think just the different sectors that lean on each other are more so here, where port and maritime will become more important to Singapore than it would be from an electric or from an energy perspective in the U.S., for example. Where we would be LNG exports, we don't necessarily have a tremendous amount of reliance on imports for power generation as Singapore would. Water system across the U.S., 55,000 different water independent systems that are operating for the local areas that they serve. Our transmission operators, we have hundreds of them, where here there's a single. And power generation assets, same thing. And down to distribution, we're 3,000 plus distribution entities. So when we think about how do we regulate, how do we audit, how do we enforce, what are the requirements they have to meet, it's a very complex environment with some of them
being large entities that take a lot of moving power to kind of get policies and procedures in place across hundreds of thousands of assets. Then we have very small entities that have zero funding, zero capabilities, and they're looking for assistance in order to achieve the minimums. Where I think Singapore is blessed that you're not too big to achieve things and kind of have a policy and a way of doing it, and you're not too small with no funding. You're just this sweet spot of a right size where you can kind of lead a number of other countries and a number of other critical infrastructures as you have the funding to do it, and it's not too large of a problem to fix. It can absolutely be a leading nation, and they have shown that through kind of their codes of practice and their OT master plans and the directions they're moving that other nations can look to and follow.
Yeah, and for cyber defenders working in this in Singapore in a critical infrastructure sector, I guess at the end of the day, cyber risk management is really about risk management, right? Taking a risk-based approach, and if the entity or the number of assets is not as critical as, say, or complex, then you take a more tailored approach based on the amount of risk and impact that you assess.
Yes, and I think in that nature, I think Singapore learned a little bit from what North America did, where we started with all of our large critical infrastructure, and we said, you take a risk-based assessment approach, you identify what's critical, and based on that list, then go do all of these things, and if you do them wrong, we'll fine you. So many of them developed a risk-based assessment and said, we don't own anything that's critical. So they didn't identify anything that they had to go action.
Oh, okay.
And that went that way for a number of years until that became common knowledge, and how much of our infrastructure was defined as critical, and it was less than 23%. And we knew we obviously couldn't run our electric system that way, and we couldn't run our generation assets that way. So they pivoted towards criteria-based. And they said, if you own a generating station that's 1,500 megawatts or more, it is to be treated this way. If you own a substation that has 3 or 4 345 lines, it's going to be treated this way. So they moved more towards a risk assessment that was whole of nation, of we're going to identify based on engineering, based on power flow, based on studies and system analysis. If you have this type of asset, it's going to be protected in this way. And when I look towards, or look to the master plan and the code of practices, it's moving into each one of those sectors and saying these things will be protected and governed in this way. Less open for debate and discussion on whether they should or shouldn't act.
I guess it's more practical, isn't it? It's more prescriptive, and yet it's quite very straightforward. There's no room for negotiation or debate.
And I believe also a number of if I read the requirements and compare them to other regulations that I've worked with, it's clear they've pulled a lot of information and learned from other places where we went through 10 years of mistakes and lessons learned and fixing. They started from that point and didn't make all the same mistakes, which is encouraging.
Well, we have United States to learn from, right?
Well, we're all learning from each other.
You paved the way and we follow, all right? So talking about some of these cybersecurity defense principles, I thought that it will be quite useful for our audience to learn about, what are some of the common sort of pitfalls or, things to avoid or big lessons, takeaways.
I think misunderstanding or assuming certain things of an adversary. I see that in critical infrastructure everywhere I go, where people pretend like they are the ones in control of an adversary group. They'll say, no one will ever attack us, we're too small. That's not your decision to make. Meaning, if an adversary group is looking towards a small distribution company in Ukraine, that might be the perfect target for them to display a capability and demonstrate it to the world.
It's not proof of concept for their malware as well.
It's not up to that target to decide whether an adversary. So misunderstanding how adversary groups work and when they may kind of do target selection versus target of opportunity towards a specific organization. Certainly misunderstanding kind of a response capability and looking towards, we have invested a lot of money in our IT defenses, and that somehow is going to cascade down, and we are then protected in our OT or in our ICS areas. If you go to any organization and sort of ask where they're spending their money in cybersecurity, you will often hear great things that are happening in the IT space of perimeter and malware detection and endpoint. And then as you start to move down into the plant floor, you're seeing open communications, open third-party connections coming in and remote access that doesn't have the same requirements as what's above in the IT space, and just assuming you have this kind of umbrella protection that'll cascade down without direct investment in your critical infrastructure. The last piece, I think, pitfalls is not investing in the workforce. We're seeing that globally. So aging workforce, people retiring out, encouraging people to get into the space, which is, I can understand why there's a reluctance. In order to perform really, really well, you need an engineering background, an operational background, an IT cybersecurity background, an operational technology or ICS. It is. So, but trying to bring people in and sort of find where their skills and talents are, and then adding on to that over a career or over a number of years of work versus looking for that coming in the door. It's the job requirements that are being listed now are almost impossible for people to satisfy. And they could go work a number of other places in banking or in finance or e-commerce where they can make similar salaries without that level of requirements. At this point, we would take anybody from an engineering side and try to teach them cybersecurity. We would take a cybersecurity person and try to teach them operations and engineering. It's important for people to focus on kind of the training and development, and then how do they retain some of those people in the sector.
Yeah, you talk about bringing the engineers and teaching them about cybersecurity and the IT about the engineering side of things. So how is that conversation going?
Some organizations that I'm kind of familiar with, and during the summit here, this was a topic that people were asking. Where we have seen some level of success is what we would call embedded operations. So somebody from IT coming and working in an operational area for 6 months, and somebody from operations going and working in IT for 6 months, and doing this kind of prisoner exchange program where they move back and forth, and they work 6 months in an area, and then they rotate out. And in some cases, they decide that's where they want to stay. That's what they're declaring as their new home, and that's good. In other cases, it's better to send them back so they start spreading and being kind of a champion. And
that's true.
Eventually, when you hear kind of the phrase of IT and OT convergence, you shouldn't think of technology. That kind of convergence happened 15 years ago, where we're using Dell servers in an operational space, or we're using Windows in an operational space, or Cisco or Juniper. The technology has converged a decade and a half ago. The OT convergence, as it's being talked about now, is at an org chart level of who's responsible for what. There is tremendous things on the OT ICS side that we should be learning and getting from the IT side on Active Directory, on firewall admin, on network detection and response, on SOC operations, and then the IT people coming over and understanding the drivers and constraints around the system. How do you treat it differently? You're not just running through and doing patching, and you're not doing dark windows and maintenance windows. These systems do not go down. You don't maintain them that way. You have to achieve protections in other ways. So there's a ton that they could marry and learn from each other. Generally, there's kind of this organizational divide that they often don't work well together.
I think it's quite a long conversation that we can get into if we want to talk about the origins of this divide, and and there's some, of course, there's some argument that it had always been an integrated end-to-end sort of risk management for the industrial control system sector, but it's the IT people came in and then they divided. But it's a long conversation, isn't it?
It's important, I think, for the operational technology and the ICS people to not forget why they're special, and really focus on kind of the IT and OT, that first letter of those acronyms. One is information and one is operations, and they cannot lose focus on operations and the need to work with operations management, operations engineers, plant production schedules. They can't just go in and treat it like it's all just technology. We're going to patch these servers, it'll fail over. There's too much safety and reliability impact and risk.
You can't bring the systems down and say, okay, we're going to do a 2-hour maintenance.
No, it doesn't exist. No such thing.
And then you tell the people, hey, sorry, you can't have electricity for 2 hours, shut down.
Correct.
Okay. So thank you, Tim, for your time today. I think we can, go and delve deeper into a lot of these areas. But in the interest of time, I think we have to wrap this up. But one last question. So the ICS Summit 2022 in APAC. Tell us about, what are the key takeaways?
A key takeaway for me, so I think it's important from a SANS perspective. We came here in 2013 after we built our first class. This was the first place we offered it. and just kind of seeing, a smaller room, more dedicated people. This is what they've done for a portion of their career. They were interested in taking our first course, finding out who SANS was, and how much more it's matured over the many years. How much more people are in this space, and just a hunger for knowledge and a hunger for kind of continuing to move the ball. While I've been here, I've had an opportunity to go to a couple of different universities and seeing what's happening with exercises in country, what's happening with kind of real-world, hands-on experience. It's just very encouraging, and I look forward to coming back again every year.
So 2013 was your first class here in Singapore. Not in the world though. It's in the region.
We ran one beta for a private customer, and then we came here.
Wow. Okay.
This was our first public run ever.
Wow. Okay. So we were your sort of
we came here first.
You trial your proof of concept in Singapore. It worked out quite well.
Yes.
Oh,
yes.
Well
It's
done.
been lovely.
Right. Okay. So we look forward to having you back next year.
Next year,
for the
we'll be back here
summit.
in May. Then we'll be back here again in November, and probably some in between.
All right. Okay. So perhaps we catch up then and see how the threat landscape,
of course,
has evolved and whether we are getting better
That'd
at
be
the
great.
same time as well.
That'd
Thank
be
you,
great.
Tim.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.